starts talking about climate to her, and he mansplains her own book to her. So my reading is from her book, From Despair to Possibility. It's late and we're deep in an emergency, but it's not too late because the emergency's not over. The outcome is not decided. We are deciding now. The longer we wait to act, the more limited the options, but scientists tell us that there are good options and great urgency to embrace them while we can. An emergency is when a stable situation destabilizes, when the house catches fire or the dam breaks or an institution implodes, when the failure or sudden change or crisis calls for urgent response. It's when it becomes clear that the way things were is not how they're going to be. An emergency can involve terrible loss, or it can bring about magnificent transformation. And while it's unfolding, the outcome can be impossible to foresee, but the future still depends on what you or we do. The word emergency comes from emerge, to exit, to leave behind, to separate yourself from. So an emergency is when you exit from the familiar and the stable. And we're now doing that on a planetary scale. Exiting the stability and reliability of the delicately tuned systems of seasons, weather, relations between species, even the shape of the world. For the past 10,000 years, as oceans draw new coastlines, lakes dry up, glaciers melt, and natural and human communities shift and migrate. It's an exodus into the unknown, and our task is to make a home there for ourselves and for the nature from which we can never be separate. The words of feminist and climate activist Rebecca Solnit. Well, I've been waiting for some time to talk more deeply about where we are in our interconnectedness with the natural world, and about my belief that the drama and the battle over our relationship to nature doesn't have to end badly. But we do need to talk about climate, about environmental stewardship. We need to talk about the grief that we feel, about how we want to envision the future, and about the need to stay committed to activism to that end. And so we know that conversations about climate have implications for politics and leadership. They have implications for economies and well-being of nations and groups of people. And so how we handle our resources and climate change is a clear indicator of what we want to value, whether it's more important to have a new tourist hotel or to have a preserved shoreline like Artist Boat is trying to do that's habitat to our fellow creatures. Climate is the most important thing we should be attending to right now, because attention to the natural world and to climate is the bedrock, really, for all other forms of social justice. It used to be that there was just so much bounty, even just a century ago, that it felt safe to be a little selfish, to keep using up our resources, but more and more we realize what we stand to lose. And so are we strong enough to create our vision of the future? And will we make that happen by the decisions and the activism that we pursue? So I have a story, it's a metaphor, for the way we can face what Rebecca Solnit calls the emergencies of the world when the prognosis is not good. It was probably about 6 years ago now, and I was walking across a field, and the heel of my shoe caught in a hole. And I wrenched my knee so hard that I screamed, and I just really could not continue to walk on. And I was by myself, and I didn't have anything to hold on to, and I started to cry, and I was jumping on one leg, and not just because I was alone and in pain. I didn't know how I was even going to get back to my car and drive home. But somehow I did. And the next day I went to see an orthopedist, and he looked at my x-ray, and he said, "Ma'am, this is really bad." And he told me it was going to be such a long, slow recovery, and that I'd probably have to have knee replacement surgery within the year. Well, it was a hard recovery, and I couldn't really walk for several weeks. And my sister was bringing me food every day like I was already ready for Meals on Wheels. But I had kept on thinking about what the doctor said to me. It's bad. You're not going to get over this. And from the back of my mind arose the stubborn thought, no, that is not what's going to happen. But even as I said it, I knew there was a possibility that it was true and that he was right. But I wasn't going to give into it just right off the bat. And so when we talk about climate, it's sort of the same. Do not acquiesce in advance. And we hear that wisdom these days as we look to the rising fascism in our nation. When we think about what's going on in the government, do not acquiesce in advance. And so that's our advice for how we think about Mother Earth. Everything is hanging in the balance between despair and recovery, but many of us have decided, despair? That is not where I am going to go with this. And we respond with determination for the future that we want. Every decision we make in our communities, that we make politically and economically now, should take into account the future of the air, the water, and the land. Doesn't it seem that the present is something that was totally unimaginable just 5 years ago? I mean, we didn't know about AI. 40 years ago, we barely knew about computers. And 100 years ago, there was not even television. All of these amazing advances, but often these things come with consequences that are just unforeseen. And capitalists and countries don't think about water quality or species preservation unless laws make them. They have self-enrichment and power as their goal, and respect for people, lands, and culture, not so much. We have been at a turning point for some time, but we keep on backsliding. We have morally compromised ourselves by abuse and overuse of the land, by mistakes and decisions that seem hard to reverse. But we have to believe that change is still possible, and we have to actually feel what we stand to lose. Well, in the 17th century, there was a group of Quaker men in England who wanted to abolish slavery. But slavery was tied to economics, and everyone said, well, that ship has literally sailed, and it is full of human cargo who are going to work for the cotton fields and the sugar plantations of the Americas. And they said, this institution, slavery, cannot be disassembled, and nations don't want it done. But it was done. It was done. And at one time, a major source of fuel was whale oil, and the killing of these beautiful, intelligent creatures was rampant. But hey, so what? People got to read at night. And at one time, our cities were black with dust and residue from the burning of coal, and mountainsides were stripped and ruined in order to find new seams of anthracite. Generations of families lived in poverty, and they owed their livelihood to mining corporations or to tea plantations or companies that made beaver hats or hats with the feathers of exotic birds. And all of those things were norms at one point in history. And so right now, as we watch gas prices rise to over $4 a gallon and see the disruptions in the Middle East and the closure of the Gulf of Hormuz, right now, we can't seem to live without fossil fuel, but yet we know this can't go on. This mustn't go on. But it will unless we find new ways of doing things in renewable ways, in ways that understand that our souls, as well as our bodies, are connected to the creatures and the landforms and the resources of the earth. The relationship between colonialism and capitalism and climate destruction has always been clear, but we sitting here today, we were born into this. And when you're born into a juggernaut, and a juggernaut is a system that has just developed a momentum, and it seems unstoppable, so you feel no option but just to play along. But just think of the examples I just gave you of how things were commonplace at one time, but unacceptable now. If the present is something that was totally unimaginable in the past, the future is something that might be totally unimaginable now. And so we get to decide whether it's worth the economic inequity, the injustice and the damage, worth the destruction and the loss that would have to be inflicted if we keep on in our same direction just because we're so used to it, because it's familiar. And so one of the keys to overturning the climate and economic wrongs of the present, I'm here to tell you, is grief. Grief. To recognize the losses and the pain and maybe even the utter hopelessness of where we stand at this moment. Rebecca Solnit says that despite everything we're going through in terms of global warming and deregulation and reversal of climate protection, she loves an emergency. Because yes, it's a scary time and things could get worse or fall apart, but things could also get better or change in some way. So let's emerge from something. Let's go into something new. It's a decision of reckoning, time to get unstuck. I see it at the hospital when it takes a near catastrophe or a life threatener to get people to go a new way, to have a new habit, or to take more care of the ecosystem of their own bodies. And so in a strange way, an emergency can be a cause for joy, but it all begins with that wrenching grief over what has happened, what has been done. The American Psychological Association has recognized it as a real disorder that people have when they're affected by weather-related phenomena such as fires and hurricanes and earthquakes, or when they're consumed with PTSD and worry about the elimination of habitat, about flood or drought, about unprecedented heat or rising sea levels. It's called eco-anxiety and climate grief. And a lot of times these sufferers are people who live close to the land. Maybe they're indigenous people who have already experienced the cultural and economic grief of having their ancestral places taken away from them. But climate grief has added an extra layer. Whole ecosystems are disrupted, everything for them from the killing of the buffalo in the 19th century to the appropriation of a river for an oil pipeline to the melting of ice that supports animals and our traditional sources of food and clothing. And climate grief is also felt by those who work closely with issues around the environment, and they are starting to become afraid that they're losing the battle. But increasingly, climate grief is experienced by people just like us, people who remember even our own childhoods, that winter, that beautiful snow, that snow doesn't happen anymore, or the time we saw that enormous flock of turkeys, how magical that was, the summer trip to the lake or the waterfall, that valley that was full of trees that's now full of housing developments. And so if you don't feel grief for the world, it's possible that you just don't know the extent of what has happened and been lost. Maybe you're just too young. Maybe not in this room, but yeah. But for some, a trip to the mall or playing games online will make them happy. And so even we tend to be happy with our cars and our air conditioning and our clothes from China as things that we have worked for and that we deserve to have. But we must remember the history that brought us to this point, the exploitation of other lands and resources that was done. And we must remember that Western white society is overprivileged, and our share of things is not proportionate. To say, but none of it was done on my watch, is to deny not only the grief that we ought to feel, but to deny the responsibility that we ought to have and the realization that we're not powerless. In fact, it's really up to us. And feeling grief is a necessary prelude to change. It's a necessary prelude to finding community that agrees that things don't have to keep on being the way that they've been. So what if joy is not a trip to Walmart or Target? What if joy is slow? What if it involved more people and not just your immediate circle? What if it was a way to deal with the threats we're experiencing a way to begin a process of restoration and renewal. What if that was what we needed? And so our task is to make a space in the reality that exists and decide that we have agency. We have the ability to do something about it. And the greatest activists simply say, this is the right thing to do, and we will behave as if the future that does not yet exist is already here. And we won't agree to this status quo, to capitalist greed or to moral wrongdoing. And we will use our agency, even if it seems just like a tiny spit in the ocean of hopelessness. And our great Unitarian environmentalist and activist, Henry David Thoreau, was so good at this. He had big picture vision. Back in 1846, he saw clearly that the US invasion of Mexico was an imperialistic land grab, and that was going to be done in the name of expanded commerce, which was dependent on slavery. And so he wanted to do more than just lament this problem or denounce the government. So he refused to pay his taxes, which would have funded US efforts, and he was sent to jail. And so people said, that was useless. That was such a small thing to do. You're not going to stop anything. But doing the right thing was greater for him than the dictates of the law. And his civil disobedience has been the inspiration for people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and their justice movements a century later. And all of it began with his wonder and respect for nature and for his understanding of our interconnectedness, living in harmony with the world and one another. And so don't ever think that you can't do something. It might be small, but do it because it's right. And you have to have hope in the face of this hopelessness and play a long game. In 2004, Wangari Maathai of Kenya won the Nobel Peace Prize. And she was the originator of the Greenbelt movement back in 1977. And she helped to plant 30 million trees in Africa. And those trees provided wood for fire, for shelter, for food, and especially helped the lives of women economically, as well as filtered the air and worked against global warming. And Maathai knew that the results were not immediate. I mean, when you put that little seedling in the ground, you think that's really not going to help a lot. But she knew that helping the earth was a way to heal the wounded lives of her fellow Africans. And so right now, we don't know whether electric vehicles can predominate. We don't know if it will become the norm for there to be wind and solar power instead of fossil fuel. Maybe there's something else out there. We still have to be expectant, but we know we do have to decrease our dependence on fossil fuel because it's the right thing to do. And so one thing that we can do is to stop acting as if we're only responsible for ourselves, to our little family group, as if that's all that matters. Being really individualistic doesn't help the larger world and the community. What does it really mean when we quote that principle, saying that we're an interconnected web of all that exists? How do you live that? We can stop saying, well, you do you, and I'll do me, and if I want to buy my clothes from China, I'll just do that. Little walls between us everywhere. As privileged people, we need to recall the hopelessness that people in other parts of the world are experiencing. And we need to be activists for the creatures and the lands that can't speak for themselves. So if a corporation can be an entity with rights, why can't a river or a mountain be one? Hope doesn't ensure that things will transform or be put to rights, but hope is the certainty that something is worth doing. Again and again, environmental and indigenous activists fail in the pressure from the government and lobbyists, but they still educate others about the commitment that we should have to the natural world. And they normalize going in a better direction. And so hope starts small, but it can be harnessed to larger goals. And so use your hope like an axe to break down the door of injustice and use it as a part of your discipline to keep behaving as if the future the just future was already here. So let's hold the vision for what it is we want. We live in the reality of what is not optimal and of what at times is truly horrific, but let us enact our lives for the world ahead that does not yet exist, and let our activism for what is right make us brave in the face of the grief that we have. It's the holding of that future that makes joy in our moments right now, and so let's fight for that vision and joyfully seize our agency and our determination to live as if what we envision is indeed still possible. Amen. And so one of the hopeful things that we do every year here at our congregation and in Unitarian Universalism is to celebrate flower communion. It's one of the ways we think about the Easter story after restoration after loss, and it was pointed out to me that today is Eastern Orthodox Easter, in Russian Orthodox Easter, and so we're still on point for that. And it's one of the ways that we honor the restart of life in the cycle of the seasons, and just one of the ways that we demonstrate love and hope in our unique UU manner. Well, flower communion was introduced in 1940 by Maha Chapek, who was the Czech-born wife of a Baptist minister turned Unitarian, and she herself was an ordained Unitarian minister. They established a church in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and Norbert Chapek, her husband, was taken prisoner by the Nazis. And while she was on a visit to the U.S., and he died in a concentration camp. So she started the flower communion sort of as a symbol of resistance against oppression, a symbol of hope, and in memory of those that we love. So our flowers remind us that ultimately we can believe in the resilience of the human spirit, in our sense of hope and renewal for the earth, and we bear witness to the fact that we, like flowers, are unique beings who are here to provide joy to one another. And so please come forward, and I'm going to try to make this simple. You're going to hand a flower to the person behind you, and you're going to take one back to your seat. So take a flower, pass a flower. And if you would like a flower brought to you, just raise your hand and we will bring it to you at your seat. And Margaret will play Spirit of Life as our background music. We need to give one to Margaret. Thank you all for your participation in that. Now, look at the insert in your order of service and let us together repeat the blessing of the flowers. Infinite Spirit of life, we ask your blessing on these symbols of love and hope. May they remind us, amid the diversity of our knowledge and of gifts, to be one in affection and devotion to good and beauty. May they also remind us of fellowship, of doing and sharing with one another. May we cherish friendship as one of your most precious gifts. May we realize that whatever we do, great or small, the effort of all of us is needed to heal our world. May we be strengthened by the one spirit of love that unites us, and may we endeavor together prosperity of a more joyful life for all. Amen. And now rise as you're willing and able for our closing hymn, number 61, Lo, the Earth Awakes Again.